Okay, let's get this shit rolling. There we go. I don't drink straight out of the can because I think it's trashy. Now, first things first. I don't know what the hell's wrong with you people, but, like, you watched my video over 1,000 times in the last 3 days, and, I mean, why? That doesn't make sense. Why would you listen to an old man talk about programming that many times? I don't get it. Anyway, yeah, all that fucking foam. You gotta let it calm down. Not an actual sponsor, but Deschutes Brewery's Jubile Ale is fucking amazing. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, you should pick some up and try it. It's pretty much the only beer I drink, and it's seasonal, so... I mean, I drink Guinness, but, you know, drinking Guinness all the time is just kind of boring. The rest of the year, I mostly go with rum and Coke. Or the Cuba Libre, as we used to call it. Anyway... Kind of the elephant in the room. A lot of people have asked why I don't have an overarching manager class. Now, a lot of people asked about a manager class, a game manager object, a state manager object, a global object. There was one fairly extensive discussion of a scheduler. And I don't really know what to think of that scheduler idea, because why would you schedule something that's already happened? What they're kind of talking about is an event queue, and an event queue makes sense. Okay, there are times that you want to use an event queue for everything, but there are problems that you solve by using a scheduler, and when they says scheduler, he asked specifically why there are no object-oriented kernel schedulers. Kernel schedulers are marshaling limited resources among a number of threads of execution. And yeah, I'm of the generation that in order to get any real credit in CS classes, you had to write a kernel scheduler. I mean, we started out writing a lexical parser, and then turning that lexical parser into a compiler, and then using that compiler to compile the task scheduler for a Unix-compatible operating system. And this was back in the days when we didn't really have Linux. We were operating under the BSD kernel. And this kind of stuff, it feels like a lot of people interpret this as being quote-unquote real programming, when it's solving a problem that I don't have. I mean, I'm building a 2D pixel graphics game. I can fairly easily handle thousands of objects without really worrying about it. I mean, I've got 64 gigs of RAM in this machine. The kind of stuff that I'm working with here is just, resources aren't limited. I mean, really, the question is not how much can I optimize this? It's how sloppy am I allowed to be? Because I can be really fucking sloppy and still have resources to spare. it's just not that big and complex a game. Okay, I mean, the play field that I'm working with right now is like it's a 16K. It's a 16K monitor basically. It's about 8K wide and it's about 4K tall, so yeah, about 32K. And what I'm thinking about for the full scale game is to upscale that so it's 16K on a side. So it's 8192 by 8192 for each of the four areas, and that's still just like that's just 256 megapixels. It's not a whole lot. It's like it's the size of a photograph, and depending on how I implement objects and pickups, there just aren't gonna be that many. I mean, we're talking a maximum of about 1 million sprites in the world at a time, and you can't fit all of them on the screen, you know. And on top of that, it's just there's a lot of optimization that goes on that just doesn't need to happen. And sometimes it doesn't even feel like it's really an optimization. Like back in the 90s, I wrote games using procedural programming. You know, I mean, to give you an idea just how fucking old I am, I remember when you used to have to buy your browser on physical media. You know, it's the world has changed a lot, but back in the 90s when I was building games using procedural programming approaches, those approaches sucked. And the reason they sucked is that you always ended up with this massive inner game loop because you would inline everything to make everything fit into your 640K that you had under DOS. And you didn't even get the whole 640K. You got like 570 or something. And in order to make everything fit into that space under DOS, you had to cram everything you could into one little space. You had to inline all of your stuff, and you had to unroll your loops for optimization and efficiency. And all of that just resulted in these massive, huge procedures that handled like everything, and you interlaced stuff in order to make things work with the proper timing. You'd be like, okay, we'll do that, and we'll do this, and we'll do that, and we'll do this, and we'll go back and forth, and then they'll finish around the same time. And you don't have to do that anymore, because it's like one of the things that I got to thinking about was we were talking about the move object code and whether that should go into the player or whether it should go into the individual pickup for the experience. And if we put it all into the player, then what we end up having to do is enumerate the child nodes that might be a pickup and separate out the pickups. And after separating out a pickup, we have to decide whether that pickup is close enough. And there are various methods we can use to cull the objects and make sure that we don't process more than we need to. But if we do all of that in the player, if we do this huge loop in there, then the only difference if we do a management class is we would take that code out of the player. We would put it in a separate area. It doesn't matter whether it goes into another class or whether it just goes in a procedure that's not in an object. That's irrelevant. The code just lives somewhere else. And the only real difference is that we now need to access the player object or the area of memory where the player is. And we need to go in there and we need to say, what is the player's location and what is the player's pickup radius? If we put that code in the player object, well, the player already knows what its position is. The player already knows what its pickup radius is. But even if we push it out here into this separate area, wherever it's sitting out in that separate area, we're just going to initialize a variable at the startup of the program. We're going to say, okay, here's a reference to the player variable so you can get the position and pickup radius. So we're talking about one additional line of code during initialization that executes in a matter of microseconds. So to the computer, there's no difference between having it up here and having it in the player. There's no difference to the computer in that. The difference is that now, in order to see how the player picks up the experience, you have to look at a secret third thing that's neither the player nor the experience. That's not good for the programmer who's looking at this code and trying to figure out how it works. That's a riddle that the programmer is expected to solve. I don't like those. I don't like riddles that programmers are expected to solve to figure out how stuff works. Now, even when you have in there, you go, okay, the player is going to fire off the look for experience message. And when it fires off the look for experience message, then there's going to be a scanner. And the scanner is going to get that look for experience message asynchronously. Whenever you say asynchronously, whenever you talk about message passing, whenever you talk about scheduling, whenever you talk about it's going to happen later, I want you to think of that as meaning we're going to break the linear program flow so the debugging experience sucks shit. Because that's what it actually means. Whenever you do that, whenever you say, I'm going to fire off a message, what you're saying is, I'm going to ruin single-step debugging. I'm going to break this debugging session, and I'm going to make the user figure out where that message went and break there. So, right there, I don't like that. I don't like the way that shakes out. I'm not an expert debugger. I don't want to be an expert debugger. And the reason that I'm not an expert debugger and I don't want to be an expert debugger is you shouldn't spend a lot of time debugging. Whenever you're debugging your code, it means something's broken. I don't like things to be broken. I don't want to spend a lot of time with shit broken in my code. So, yeah, you know, whenever I have to go into the debugger, I'm like, now, how do you do this again? I know how to set a breakpoint, and I know that you can single step, but what's the hotkey again? And how does this work? How do you step in? How do you step out? How do you step over? I want to have to look that up again every single time I start the debugger. I never want to be so good at the debugger that I remember all of the hotkeys and how everything works. I don't want to be that person. So, when you send that message, when you fire off that event, and you break linear debugging, you're going to make somebody go off into the code and go, well, what receives this? And they're searching everywhere. It could be anywhere. Once you leave this particular object, once you've gone out of the player and the experience pickup, once you go out of those two objects, it could be anywhere. It could be anywhere in the project whatsoever. And you have to search everywhere for it. You have to search for that message everywhere that it could possibly be picked up. And that's never fun. You can add a comment that says this will be picked up in such and such, but comments like that tend to go out of date and nobody updates them. Especially when you're firing off messages at 300 places in your code and you change where that part of the event scheduler lives. And then when you change it, you go, okay, I got to go update all of the places where I changed it. And you get through like 50 of them and then you have a meeting. And you never get to the other 250. And now you're directing 5 out of 6 people who are looking at messages to the wrong place because you just lost track of what you were doing. Shit like that happens all the time. It's very much a problem, and it's very much something that you should try to avoid. But whenever you see something that can go wrong, just remember Murphy's Law. Whatever can go wrong will. If you leave a comment in your code, you cannot guarantee that that comment will never go out of date. And even if it's you, you know, I mean, I can't count the number of times that I have forgotten that me in 6 months is a different person. Oh, I'll remember where that is. Oh, I'll remember how that works. Oh, I know what that means. No, I fucking don't. I have no fucking clue what that means later on down the road. And you spend enough years writing code and you learn just how much of a fuck up you really are. Because human beings are fuck ups. You fuck up less often, but you still fuck up, you know? And they're the same fuck ups over and over again. But that, of course, begs the question. Even when you don't do a scheduler or an object up over top of it, okay? The difference in execution speed between doing it here and doing it down in the player object, it's minuscule. There's no difference between the two. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It doesn't make any difference to the code. It only makes a difference to the people trying to read the code, which is going to be me in 6 months. And I'm not going to know, well, what the fuck? Why is this going up here? Where's the scheduler? Where did I put the scheduler? I'm an idiot. Because I am. I'm an idiot. We're all fucking idiots. We all do dumb shit all the fucking time. So leaving it in either the player code or the object code makes sense. So why wouldn't I do it in the player? Well, let's take a look at what I'm working with here. I'm working in Godot 4. I've got a 4.4 build over here, and they've fixed the tooltip problem. I'm very happy that they have fixed the tooltip problem. That's very nice. I like that. They're not flashing on and off anymore. I'm very pleased with that. But because I'm working in Godot, it's an inherently object-oriented environment. And because I'm working not only in Godot, but using C#, the idea of doing anything in a procedural fashion, that's not realistic. That's not the way things are going to work in this project. I'm already committed to a certain approach and a certain way of working with this. And it doesn't simplify anything to throw it all out and start over with a different approach. It does simplify things to throw it out and start over with a different architecture in mind, which I'm likely to do later on, because some of the stuff that I'm doing in here I'm not 100% happy with. And there are obviously questions and there are issues that I'm going to deal with as I work with this. But the reason I didn't go with the player on this, the reason I didn't go with putting this code in the player is because in order to put this code in the player, I need to iterate across the ground tiles, which I've got 4 ground tiles here, and each of them could conceivably have pickups on them. Okay? We've got a little pickup here. I made a little blue orb that looks like shit, but it's placeholder graphics anyway. I don't care. Any of these 4 tiles could have pickups in them, and all of them need to be checked to see whether we need to scan them. We need to check the ground 1 tile and say, is anything within the ground 1 tile within pickup range? If any part of the ground 1 tile is within pickup range, then we need to scan ground 1. And because the items on the tile aren't in any way sorted or arranged or clustered, we need to check all of the objects. In addition, as we're checking through all of the objects, not all of the objects we're checking could be picked up. So we need to check whether ground 1 is within pickup range, and then we need to check every object on ground 1 to see can it be picked up, and if it can be picked up, is the object within pickup range? Now, if no part of ground 1 is within pickup range, we can just throw the whole thing out and go, no, we don't need to check any of that. We call that part of the object tree. And then we go through the same thing with ground 2. Is any part of ground 2 within pickup range? And you can see right here, here's ground 1, here's ground 2, here's ground 3, here's ground 4. And as you can see with the player right here near the intersection of all 4 tiles, all 4 of them are within pickup range. And because all 4 of them are within pickup range, we have to scan all 4 of them. So what that means is we're iterating across each of these 4 tiles to look at every single object and see whether it can be picked up. Well, here's the problem with that. Godot, as part of the processing loop, iterates the entire tree and runs the process function on each and every one of these objects, including the pickups. So by the time we get down to the player, which is the last in the list of things that run, I now need to iterate all of the nodes in the tiles that are within range when the engine's already iterated through them. So I'm now iterating through them twice. I'm letting the engine do it once, and then I'm doing it myself manually. That doesn't seem very smart. And that's why I decided that what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it within the pickup. And as you can see here, the first thing I do is when I first start up, I grab a reference to the player object. That's exactly what I was going to do in the manager class anyway. You grab a reference to the player object, you cache it, you keep it around, and you use that to check the position and everything. Now, one minor issue with this is I have to run that on every single pickup when it gets placed on the screen. As soon as it gets placed on the screen, I've got to grab a reference to the player and I've got to store it. So I'm storing dozens, hundreds, thousands of references to the player. That's fine. I don't really have a problem with that. It's not like I'm going to be storing millions of them. Even if I am, what's a couple megs of memory? It's not a huge deal, right? So that brings us down to the actual code that moves this particular pickup. And the first thing is, I have this little thing here called magnet. The reason I have a Boolean in here called magnet is there's a fairly common pickup you have in games like this, where you grab it and all of the experience currently on screen immediately begins moving toward you. You immediately pick it up whether it's in range or not. So by having this magnet bit right here, what I can do is when you pick up that particular object, at that point I can emit a signal. And that signal can say, if you're available to be picked up, then flip your magnet bit on. And I can have all of these different objects see that event and say, okay, it's time to turn the magnet bit on. And eventually the event is completely consumed, everything has seen it, and everything is turned on, and then everything moves toward the player. So if magnet is true, then we're going to move toward the player. And all I have to do is I start off by saying, if we're more than 8 pixels away from the player, which is just the maximum pickup distance that I'm going to get to, then as long as we're more than 8 pixels away from the player, if we're not up to full speed, then increase our speed by our acceleration times the delta. And we're going to set the global position using the current speed. And this is just a fairly simple calculation. It doesn't collide. The experience rods will travel through anything. They pay no attention to obstacles. They pay no attention to monsters. They do not even have a collision hull. They just exist, and when they get within 8 pixels, then they're consumed. And we consume them by just calling Q free. Normally, I would play a sound and add a value to the player's experience level. I don't have that implemented yet, so I just free them from the queue, and they disappear from the tree. Now, if magnet is not true, then what I do is I say, hey, if the distance is less than the player's pickup range, then we're going to set magnet true just for this one object. And we're going to set its current speed to 0 because it's not moving yet. That's just a sanity check right there. And what we end up with, if I go ahead and build this, is I've also implemented a basic enemy AI. So the AI chases you around. That's interesting. You can get trapped between the enemy and an obstacle. If I get close enough to the orb, you'll see that it moves over and gets consumed. It gets freed out of the tree and then it disappears. And you can see that my my little groper here is following me around all over the place. Now let me restart this. And what I want to demonstrate here is that if I come up, damn it. I walked too close and picked it up. So if I keep moving over here and I come all the way to the edge of this, now if I've done this correctly, this will work. I think I've done this correctly. I hope I've done this correctly. Now when I get to the edge of the green here, you'll see first of all the greeble comes up, which is our little bush that sits over here toward the end of the screen. There it is. And there's that orb once again. Now this is something that that happens because this is a child of that tile. So because the object is an immediate child of the tile ground 4, when ground 4 moves to the opposite end of the screen, the pickup goes with it. And because the pickup goes with it, you can then pick it up. You don't have to do it that way. What you can do is you can have the pickup just live in global space. And if the pickup just lives in global space and isn't a child of the ground tile, then when the ground tile moves, the pickup isn't on it. The pickup is just floating out in space with nothing under it. So the question is, if you walk really, really far from a piece of experience, do you wrap around and get to the experience, or does it just get farther and farther away? I want you to be able to wrap around and get to the experience, so that's the way that I've implemented this with it as children of the ground tile, which complicates doing a loop, because when you're doing a loop, you have to iterate across all of the ground tiles. Now the new thing that I need to think about is first of all, the pickup that I have the player picking up, that should be a weapon. The player obviously needs to have a weapon that they can then shoot. And once the player has a weapon they can shoot, then shooting the weapon should be able to damage the enemy. And once the enemy is sufficiently damaged, the enemy should die. And when the enemy dies, it should drop an experience orb. Flipping that switch is something that I need to figure out, how to instantiate these things and initialize them properly. I haven't done any work toward that just yet. I have a little to-do list that I'm working on. I have a thing that I can pick up, a thing that you can shoot, the bullet, a thing you can hit, a chest. The chest drops a pickup, which would be like gold. And then I have to implement enemy health, enemy drops experience, the enemy AI, which I've done the basics of. And once I've got that together, then I need to do an enemy spawn algorithm. The enemy spawn is going to be fairly simple. It's just going to be like put an enemy somewhere off the screen so it can wander on screen and come after you. But I've got this thing up here, which is the item factory. And the item factory is going to be what creates these things. You can see that it has a greeble underneath of it, but the greeble doesn't actually show up on screen. And it doesn't show up on screen because the item factory itself is set to not visible. Now, if I come over to 2D, if I turn on visibility, you can see the greeble shows up. But then I can turn it back off, and all of its children disappear as well. I want nothing in the item factory to show up on screen. And the idea there is that the item factory is going to live far enough away from the player that that the player is not going to grab anything from it. And the core idea here is the item factory will build items, initialize them, and then make them children of the appropriate nodes. And I need to work out how that works in Godot to get everything put together properly. But the fundamental idea is pretty basic. It's like when an enemy dies, it should be fairly simple for that enemy to just instantiate the experience orb right where it is. But I'm not sure how well that's going to work. I need to play with it and see how everything specs out. But as far as doing things in a procedural way and with a scheduler, the scheduler idea isn't bad. I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying the scheduler idea is bad. It's just that the scheduler doesn't actually make this problem any easier, because you still have the same fundamental question of who calls the scheduler? It's still either the player tells the scheduler, hey, pick this thing up for me, or the object tells the scheduler, hey, I need to be picked up. It's the same problem. And then you have the guy who suggested the scheduler suggested that you have a scanner as well. And now you've got 5 objects. Now you've got the object that can be picked up, the player that can pick up the object. You've got the event scheduler that schedules when it's picked up. You have a location scanner, and you have a location and time scanner. And the complexity of this, if you have a mental model of something, if you have a mental model of how something works, fitting things into that mental model is generally pretty easy. But sometimes those models are too complicated for what's going on. And I think this is one of those cases, because adding 2 separate scanners and an event scheduler so the player can pick up experience, it seems like overkill. It seems like an awful lot of work for not much benefit, and it doesn't actually solve the problem of who calls the scheduler. Well, I guess in his system, the scanner calls the scheduler. But then the scanner's still scanning at intervals. And I don't know. I may just not understand what he's suggesting, but when he asked about kernel schedulers, my immediate thought was, thread execution. We don't have a problem with marshaling shared resources here, which is mostly what a kernel scheduler does, is manage shared resources that are scarce and there's not enough of them. So I'm not sure how he's envisioning that particular solution fixing any of this. I mean, I'm probably thinking about it wrong, and he's probably suggesting something much simpler, and I just don't get it because we don't inhabit the same brain. It's the other mind's problem. It's like a lot of things that seem obvious to me aren't obvious to other people. Like when I go, you have two things. One of them is responsible for the interaction between the two things. Well, why not a secret third thing that's responsible for the interaction? Because Occam's razor, thou shalt not multiply entities unnecessarily. I mean, that's the one that comes to mind for me, but obviously there's going to be a manager. There's lots of stuff that can't be managed by an in-game object. Like just by way of example, I mean, the playfield sits over top of everything and manages the swapping of the tiles for the map. It has to sit over top of the map, and it can't be one of the items on the map. I mean, I guess the player could do it. Really, the only things that matter are programmers only really understand three numbers. We understand 0, 1, and infinity. This should never happen. This should happen exactly once. This can happen any number of times and potentially an infinite number. And those are kind of the only things that matter. Unless you're trying to iterate over something and you go exactly this many times. We're going to go exactly this many times. But all of the code you write is written to either it only runs once, or it runs an infinite number of times, or it should never run at all. If it should never run at all, you should probably not write it. I mean, that's kind of where I sit. But we have the playfield, which sits over top of everything. And we have the item factory that sits over top of everything. Because you have items that need to own things temporarily until you give over the ownership to something else. And then when you give over that ownership, then they should pass from the responsibility of this overarching object to the object underneath of it. I'm probably not explaining it very well. Anyway, you're always going to have stuff that doesn't fit for a thing in the game, like saving your game. Nothing inside the game should be responsible for saving the game. You know, managing the configuration, your sound volume, the resolution of the game, what monitor you're on, all of that kind of sits over top of everything in what I typically call the shell. And having that shell sit over top of everything is a really useful way to encapsulate stuff that doesn't belong to any specific object within the game. So there's going to be a manager. There's always going to be a manager. But putting something into the manager is fundamentally just, I mean, it's an identical concept to putting it into any other object in the game that there's only one of. Like, anything I put in the playfield, I could conceivably put into the item factory instead. I could put it into the player instead. I could put it into any one of the ground tiles instead, as long as I don't put it in all four of them. But you put things where you put them to the purpose of an object-oriented approach to your project is so when another person is looking at your project, and again, another person includes you in 6 months when you don't remember what the fuck you did. When another person looks at your project, whatever they're trying to find, okay, you want to minimize the amount of code they need to look at. They should be able to find what they need to find and do what they need to do without looking at all of the code and understanding every last thing. So if you name things properly, and naming things is hard, if you name things properly, they can figure out where to look. And if they're thinking, you know, the player needs to pick something up, if you have an object called a pickup, they go, oh, that's probably something you can pick up. And you have an object called the player, and they go, oh, that's probably the player. If they're looking for where the player picks something up, looking in those two places makes sense. And they should be able to look at those names and go, okay, it's probably in one of those two places. If you put it in a third secret location, now it could be anywhere. They're probably going to start by looking at the top, and if you put it close enough to the top, they'll find it fairly quickly. But the whole purpose of using objects is to make it easy for another programmer to look through your object hierarchy and to look through your class definitions and to understand where the thing they're looking for is, presumably because they're trying to find and fix a bug, or they're trying to understand how something works. Like, if I take this project and I go, I'm going to throw this up on GitHub so people can look at it. If I throw it up on GitHub, it should be something that people can look at and find what they need to find and learn what they need to learn. And if it's hard to make sense of where things are located within the hierarchy, then that gets in their way. Object-oriented code is not for you right now, and it's not for the computer. It's not designed to be more efficient or to be easier to write or even to be easier to read. It's just designed to localize your code into small bite-sized pieces so that when people are looking at it, they can find what they need to find fairly quickly, and they don't need to understand a massive fuck-off procedure to know what they're doing. The first game I ever wrote in Godot back in 2016 or thereabouts, the first game I ever wrote in Godot, I wrote in very nearly a procedural fashion because that's what I did. You know, I mean, even when I was working under XNA, you know, I used some of the object-oriented features of C#. But back in the 2000s when I was working in XNA, before I switched over to Unity and then switched from Unity to Unreal and then looked at Unreal and said, oh yeah, Tim Sweetney is the devil and Epic Games is hell. And then I switched over to Godot, and when I switched over to Godot, they initially didn't have C#. They were talking about adding it, but they didn't have it yet. And the first game that I ever built in Godot had this massive fuck-off inside loop of like 60,000 lines, and every object was like instantiated by looking it up in the tree. I had a ready function in GDScript that just went on for pages, and it was just like loading everything up out of the tree. And then in the process function, it was just huge, and it was like this massive multi-megabyte file. And it was all in just those two functions, where everything was done in just those two places. And it worked, but being all in that one location, it was very brittle. because everything was interconnected and everything was interrelated. And in order to understand what was going on in the program, you had to understand the whole thing. If you didn't understand the whole thing, then it was just a mess, which meant it was just a mess. And when I ended up walking away from that to go and do something else for a while, and I came back and I looked at it, and I didn't understand what the fuck it was doing. Because you in 6 months is a different person. And that's not even that long ago, really. It's one of those things where I knew better when I did it, but I did it anyway, because there's always that part of you that goes, well, this will be easier. This will be easier. This will be faster. I'll remember where that is. I won't forget that. Oh, yeah, that's simple. I don't need to write that down. We never fucking learn. Programmers never fucking learn. And it ended up confusing as shit. I didn't know what the fuck was going on. Still have that project somewhere. I think it still runs too. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of where I am on stuff. Let's talk just real quick about the quote unquote AI for the groper. It's the same basic thing as it's the same basic thing as the player, because the groper can collide with objects. The groper has to move through objects, or it has to move around objects, rather. He can't just move through them. If you actually pay attention in Vampire Survivors, none of the enemies collide with anything. They walk through walls, they walk through obstacles, they walk through everything. They do not have to respect any of the obstacles in the area. And that's one of the optimizations, because that makes things faster. And that's one of the reasons that I want to stress test this. I want to put like several thousand enemies on the screen and make sure, does everything still work? If I spawn 100 enemies, 1,000 enemies, 10,000 enemies, 100,000 enemies, what does my frame rate do? What does performance look like? Do they still manage to collide with one another and to collide with things in the environment? But I want to get a little bit more done on this before I start stress testing it, because I also have to test the experience pickups and that sort of stuff. I want to spawn like 10,000 of those and see how that works out. And that kind of stress testing and performance testing and seeing like what you can actually do and what you can get away with, that's important to do fairly early on. But mostly what I'm concerned about is just getting a kind of vertical slice together. And that vertical slice is just one where we can spawn the enemies, there's leveling up, and then I can start thinking about what happens when you level up. Like, what abilities do you improve? How do they improve? What options do we have for that? And I need to build a little upgrade selection dialogue, figure out how that's going to work. That's my beer. So I should be jumping off air. Oh, holy shit, it's been over 45. This is ridiculous. It's one of the things that's really frustrated me about doing this is as I've been talking about programming and as I've been talking about code and as I've been jumping in here and building stuff, I'm just I'm struck by how lost I get in code. Not like in a bad way, but just like I hit that flow state and I just I can just work on stuff for hours, and I can test things and move things around and reorganize and re-architect things. And the time just flies past. I forget what's going on around me. And that's something I don't get with many other things. And it's never really happened with art. It happens with music sometimes. I mean, you can see I've got my synth over here. I got a DJ console over there. I got my Strat over here on the side. But music and code are the only things that have ever really like resonated with me to the point that I can just get lost in them. And it frustrates me because I've been working on improving my art for 6 years, and not so you'd really notice. I mean, look at this garbage. But yeah, that's sometimes the thing that you're good at and the thing you want to do don't really line up. That's frustrating. I think I want to move this a little. Let's move that there. It's a better location. Just because it's not on the border. Anyway, I got a bunch of additional stuff to do. I got a bunch of additional stuff to work on. And we'll see what else I get done. Do a little YouTube dance. Like, comment, subscribe, all of that happy horse shit. And, I mean, thanks a lot for showing up. Because, I mean, this past week, more of you have shown up than in the past 3 years. So, I don't know. Apparently, I'm doing something right. I'll try to keep doing it. Anyway, that's my time. Okay, bye.